There is no war without propaganda. It produces images of the enemy, stirs up fear, feelings of revenge, and guilt. It fights with exaggerations, with slogans and lies. Its weapons are the mass media. The power of moving pictures, initially tested in the First World War. Radio and film with sound gave propaganda completely new possibilities.
Amerikanische Sherman-Panzer brechen in ein von Infanteristen und Fallschirmjägern gehaltenes Dorf ein. Ein deutscher Kriegsberichter filmt den Panzereinbruch aus unmittelbarer Nähe.
Television brings war into living rooms.
Good morning greeting to the Viet Cong for the B-52.
In the age of the internet, it is not the lack of, but the abundance of information that makes it easy for propagandists and difficult for the truth. Millions of soldiers died in the battles of the First World War. To legitimize these sacrifices and to encourage the population to persevere, a new weapon was used for the first time that had not counted for much in the eyes of many military officers.
For me, that was the most amazing thing about the First World War, war propaganda. Until then, nations that were involved didn't have any propaganda departments or even a propaganda ministry.
For the people on the home front, the war was documented using all the latest media. A real war of images broke out in newspapers and magazines.
There was a great fascination for war photography. And of course, these newspapers and magazines received a lot of publicity. It was the only way for the general public to see images of war. And suddenly, this exclusive middle-class medium became a mass medium.
However, opinions differed widely on how this war of images should be waged. While the German Empire still hesitated, the Allies relied on brutal images of the enemy and atrocity propaganda right from the start.
War reporting has always focused on the atrocities. And they are also the point when war reporting becomes important, in the initiation phase of wars and in the escalation phase. These atrocities are something like the, yes, I would say, like the fillet of war reporting.
The invasion of Belgium, in violation of international law, during which Germans took action against alleged snipers with sometimes inexplicable severity, provided their opponents with a perfect template.
War took on a whole new quality. The Germans committed atrocious crimes while marching through Belgium, justifying it all with their motto, "Necessity knows no law. All resistance is illegitimate." There were terrible losses. 6,500 dead in August. Hundreds of men were lined up against a wall. Children and women were forced to watch. These were ghastly scenes that aroused tremendous anger and were expressed by propaganda, the likes of which had never been seen before. Excellent pictures, caricatures, propaganda, presentations were made in which this man with a very big moustache and a spiked helmet is attacking Belgian women, especially young women. And that was a propaganda defeat that the Germans never recovered from.
In German propaganda, on the other hand, cruelty was rarely found. Such depictions had long been frowned upon in the German Empire. People felt culturally superior. It was only towards the end of the war that politicians and the military attempted countermeasures.
From the very beginning and throughout the war, the German Reich was actually in an inferior position in terms of propaganda impact, particularly in the neutral countries.
This view culminated after the war in the so-called stab-in-the-back legend, a myth according to which the army remained undefeated in the field. The interpretation of history changed from cruel slaughter to heroic struggle. The National Socialists knew better than anyone how to serve up the right kind of propaganda as a guarantee of military success.
That means that the retrospective view of the war coverage was, ours was not good enough, the others was too good. So there was the idea that the war could actually have been won militarily and was only lost through treachery and propaganda.
In Europe, the atmosphere was tense long before war broke out. The saber rattling was unmistakable. Kaiser Wilhelm II wanted his own empire and provoked Great Britain by expanding his fleet. In addition, the German monarch felt surrounded by enemies. An armed conflict seemed inevitable.
War propaganda begins long before the first shot is fired. One has to tune the population to be in the mood for war. There has to be a discussion about how the war is justified, that the opponent is presented as strong, as threatening. The enemy is a danger against which one must defend oneself.
War is not yet the nightmare scenario it will be after 1918. At the beginning of the century, wars were considered legitimate. Public opinion was on the side of the emperor.
We defend it by being imperialist, but the people already believed that the others were arming and joining together in a hostile alliance to invade Germany at some point.
After the shooting in Sarajevo, the German Empire felt obliged to go to war. The Kaiser's speech, which was only documented photographically, was repeated for propaganda purposes and immortalized on a wax cylinder.
Es muss denn das Schwert nun entscheiden. Mitten im Frieden überfällt uns der Feind. Darum auf zu den Waffen. Wir werden diesen Kampf bestehen, auch gegen eine Welt von Feinden.
There was no attack, but the emperor's words met the expectations of the masses.
When wars begin, each side tries to present itself as the one being attacked. We act in self-defense, and the other is the aggressor. It's clear that when two parties fight with each other, they cannot both act in self-defense. Otherwise, we would not have a war. And here, of course, lies are used to help with the justification.
Great Britain was the first party to the war to set up an independent propaganda office, a secret staff unit that was supposed to convey seemingly objective information. There were hardly any official government reports. British propaganda had been in the hands of influential newspapermen from the very beginning.
The end of the 19th century saw the rise of the English mass media, the so-called tabloids, which are called tabloids because they were sold on the street. And so you see these press barons like Beaverbrook or Lord Northcliffe, who had big media empires. They were used as leaders in propaganda. And even before the First World War, Lord Northcliffe, with his newspapers, with his media, pursued a very massive anti-German policy.
Journalists, writers, and scientists worked for the secret office in London. In early 1915, one of the most influential pieces of anti-German propaganda appeared in Great Britain. The Bryce Report. Its author, Lord Bryce, was a respected historian. Commissioned by the Propaganda Bureau, he presented a damning report on alleged German atrocities in Belgium, for which German propaganda had little or no response.
There is also a German atrocity narrative about the Belgians, but it didn't get through. And those in Germany who did have an eye on the international press, of course, saw relatively quickly what a disaster was brewing. The Allies might have got through it even better if they hadn't overdone it. They then told terrible stories, not only about women being raped, but also about children's hands being chopped off.
The Bryce Report is based largely on unverifiable stories and alleged witness interviews, but it had a major impact, especially in neutral countries such as the United States.
Rumor mills always thrived in wartime. There were incredible news stories, and very few of it was in the newspapers. And this rumor mill exploded and led to the wildest stories that were even wilder than the reality, wilder than what the Germans had done, and led to the fact that for the first time, war reporting became aware of the dynamics involved in atrocity reports.
The cliché of the woman-abusing and child-murdering Hun offered German opponents of the war many opportunities to inflame the mood among their own population.
British and French propaganda played with this stereotype of the enemy. But with a few exceptions, it was not really produced very offensively. Compared to American films, which were very quick to take up this image of the barbarian. And these were certainly some of the wildest propaganda films of the entire First World War.
The Hun cliché was brought into play by Kaiser Wilhelm II himself several years earlier, when Allied propaganda was looking for stereotypes to mobilize its own population for the war. A controversial speech by the monarch from 1900 provided the appropriate image.
Wilhelm II.
Wilhelm II saw off the troops heading to China in the Boxer Rebellion and said, "You must fight like the Huns did under King Etzel." That is the formula. No pardon will be given. The Secretary of State for Outer Bülow, who stood next to him, was horrified when he heard that, because of course that can't be said in public, because it's against international law, and the monarch isn't allowed to say such a thing.
While the speech was still in progress, the journalists present were obliged to print a toned-down version in which the word Hun no longer appeared, but it was to no avail.
The editors scoffed and laughed because they had already heard it over the telegraph. The emperor had raged against the Chinese. That was terrible and had insane consequences.
There was a heated debate in the Reichstag. The emperor often failed to adhere to the agreed-on speech. However, no one could have imagined at the time that the Hun would become such a prolific and long-lived propaganda figure. With the introduction of new communications technologies, war reporting also gained in importance. Publishers quickly realized that reports from the front increased circulation. The military lost its monopoly on information because now the major daily newspapers were sending out civilian war correspondents.
In cases where one's own country was at war, the reports from the fronts are existential because people need to know something, no matter how good or bad it is. But you have to, and you really want to know something about how your family and friends are doing at the front, and how the war is going, and whether it will be over soon. Mostly, people at home want it to be over as soon as possible, and in that respect, war reporting is extremely important.
The need for information increased the longer the war lasted. In addition to the reporters' stories, newspapers could now also print pictures, but by today's standards, the new media was anything but up to date.
At the beginning, we didn't pay much attention to topicality, but the images had to fit the theme. Existing pictures were used. So throughout August 1914, material from the pre-war period was still being used because there was no current material or very little current material available.
From the outset, the relationship between the media and the military was a difficult one. Civilians were not provided for in the military system. Reporters leaking secrets to the enemy had long been a top concern for commanders.
The military would have liked the media people to stay away altogether. This also happened in England. War correspondents were kept away from the fronts for several months, almost an entire year, completely. because the British military commander-in-chief said, "They're only making mischief, and they're a bother, and we don't need them."
The German military, on the other hand, had plans to include reporters from the outset. The reporters had to be accredited and were integrated into the military structures. The officers chose what they got to see.
Everyone formed pools, as one would say today, and the journalists were then occasionally taken near the front. But realistically, no one really got to the front. Just like today, the journalists themselves became the object of propaganda. That's how you have to see it. These pools and this way of dealing with the war correspondents served to ensure that they themselves only saw a very carefully curated reality.
Military requirements were not the only reason why images of war often showed so little of the real horror. Another issue was the bulky technology that kept photographers and cameramen in particular away from the front.
Photographers didn't work with very small digital equipment like today, nor with rolls of film, but with glass plates. They had heavy equipment made of wood. They usually worked with a tripod. That is, they had to carry 15 to 20 kilos of weight. That meant it was heavy work.
From the very beginning, there was a huge discrepancy between the reality of war and how it was portrayed, especially in the German Empire. What people got to see of the war was manipulated reality.
A very important reason was censorship. They wanted to show pictures that depicted a chivalrous battle on one side to put them in the picture, although that was not the case at all. It was a brutal, machine-like war. It was a war of position that claimed tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of victims. But in pictures, the war appeared as a war waged by individuals against individuals.
If censorship ensured that the reports from the fronts were, I'll say it carefully, embellished, and that there were hardly any setbacks or were omitted completely, and that you also did not really know how bad the situation was for the soldiers, that they were kept in the dark about all this, then of course society's image of the war was often the wrong image.
The millions of postcards sent during the war also produced a desired reality rather than the cruel reality. Even before the outbreak of the First World War, they played a crucial role as a propaganda medium. For the frontline soldiers, they were the most important connection to home.
The vast majority were peasant boys, proletarians, simple people who had been torn out of civilian life and wanted to return to it as soon as possible. That's why something was done that had never existed before. The huge communication effort, hundreds of millions of letters, billions of letters that were sent back and forth. An incredibly sophisticated mail delivery system. Contact with the home was extremely important, and the rulers, the organizers of the war, knew that. And that's why it was organized that way.
One of the many millions of letter writers was Hans Cordes from Hamburg. The young gunner was also an enthusiastic photographer. He regularly sent home photos of himself and his comrades.
I just took a flash shot in the trench. My comrade, Martens, had given me powder. Afterwards, we developed it. He did all the photo work here. He always developed in the evening with a red flashlight.
For the first time, it was not just the professionals who produced pictures of the war. Tens of thousands of amateurs joined in on the photo front. The first small cameras made it possible, but the real war remained elusive even in their photographs.
If we take a look at the years 1914 to 1918, you can see that the majority of the pictures were actually relatively unspectacular. They are group pictures, pictures where the logistics are told in the background. In other words, photography had only been able to depict, in exceptional cases, the experiences of soldiers in the trenches.
Cinema, on the other hand, promised to bring the events of war closer. Moving images from the front drew the masses to the fledgling movie theaters. Just a few weeks after the outbreak of war, the first major German newsreel appeared. the Mester Week.
Oskar Mester
used the outbreak of war to position his newsreel. He also arranged this with the Supreme Army Command. He wanted a German newsreel so that one would no longer be dependent on the French newsreels, which were banned anyway. All nations involved in the war saw, of course, that this very popular medium also offered the chance to present one's own point of view, one's own way of justifying the war.
Mester was a member of the press department of the General Staff and was convinced of the propagandistic value of the film reports. He also developed a special camera for aerial reconnaissance. Mester was also responsible for censorship regulations. Images of current war events, the dead, the seriously wounded, weapons, aircraft, and military port facilities were generally prohibited. Moving pictures had been thrilling audiences since 1895. The Lumiere brothers astonished the public with a film in which French workers left their factory. Initially a fairground attraction for the working classes, the new medium quickly gained popularity among the middle classes as well. Cinemas became luxurious movie palaces where people wanted to be entertained.
The question of authenticity only came up for the audience at a certain moment, when the image was expected to depict a real event. And acts of war were not actually the first to fulfill this promise. That was, in fact, Princess Victoria's wedding. The crowned heads from Russia, Germany, and Great Britain came to celebrate this wedding. And then there was a cameraman, or maybe even two cameramen there. And what became meaningful for the audience was that what was supposedly depicted there actually took place.
War on film was still something quite new. The audience had high expectations of the new images, but fascination with the modern medium quickly gave way to disillusionment. The staged scenes were too easy to debunk.
First of all, there are, of course, a great many films that purported to report on the scenes of the war. These were all films that were made behind the lines. There were also many films that dealt with the requirements of warfare, that is, workers making munitions or troops being carted to the front line. Or there were films that appeared to have been shot in the trenches, but which were obviously made in training situations. Initially, these films were welcomed with great interest, but that wore off very, very quickly. The audiences realized that these were not the films they wanted to see, and in this respect, these films also met with great resistance.
In 1916, the British film The Battle of the Somme was released. It was the first feature-length documentary film. The battle was among the bloodiest of the First World War. The film was massively popular at the time because the battle was still going on when the film was released.
It's a film that from start to finish pretended to be authentic, to show how it actually was. Stevens, British Prime Minister Lloyd George's lover and mistress, went to one performance and then wrote in her diary, "Now I know how my brother is doing at the front line." That film conveyed precisely that impression, which is why it was unprecedentedly successful.
In the first 2 months alone, more than 20 million people watched the film. The British film made history and is now a UNESCO World Heritage documentary.
Of course, there was footage that was shot before the battle. That famous scene at the end where the soldiers wave and parade past the camera wasn't shot after the first days of the battle, but before the battle. Just as other scenes were shot on training grounds. And in particular, the very famous over-the-top sequence, which, as you can see in many details, was certainly not shot during the battle, but in advance on the training grounds in Great Britain.
The few staged scenes do not detract from the film's success. It went around the world and was shown in 18 countries. Startled by the success of British film propaganda, the Germans released their own version of The Somme, a film that was not intended to convey the horror of war to the audience, but rather a completely different message.
The message was that the Germans in occupied France were the victims of the British bombardment, and especially the cities, Péronne, which was destroyed by Allied guns. The second point is that it went against the image of the barbarian. That's the classic Allied image of the German soldier in the attacks, which, in fact, there were in Belgium. And that's why you see German soldiers taking care of children, how they handle their belongings carefully. You see soldiers cleaning shoes. You also see them walking along paths that also have been cleared in the ruins of Péronne. It also created the image we maintained order under the most arduous circumstances.
Showing one's own nation in a good light and blaming others is the consistent tenor of the film, which never came close to the success of its British counterpart. Our Heroes on the Somme was the first major assignment of the newly founded BUFA. Like England and France, the Empire now had its own propaganda institution.
This was an image and film propaganda site which had no other purpose than to increase war propaganda. It was gradually understood that the war must be won in the trenches. But it wouldn't be won if the general public didn't go along with it. The propaganda had to be successful as well. And for this reason, visual propaganda gained enormous importance during the last years of the war.
The Image and Film Office was founded at the request of the Supreme Army Command. Film sequences and photos were not intended to enlighten and convey the horrors of war, but to take the horror out of the carnage. The office provided viewers with light shows, such as advertisements for war bonds.
Throughout the war, German politicians and the military were watching how the war was being waged by the other side, making the war public. We all know that. And they tried to prevent exactly that in Germany. In Germany, until the end of the war, there was a sense that remaining calm was a citizen's first civic duty.
The approximately 450 employees of the Film Office, the forerunner of the UFA production company, chose, under the strictest secrecy, what would be shown to the public. Foreign films were also censored. Their work helped to downplay the image of the war among the population.
There was much more censorship than propaganda in Germany until the end of the war. Our military actually wanted to prevent the war from really spreading mentally to the population. One should work for the war. One should collect nuts for the war. Children were also supposed to do something. So, as they said at the time, you should be enthusiastic. But in Germany, there were practically no swear words for the enemy. Whereas for the Frenchmen, there was the Boche, the Hun, someone who's bull-necked, double-chinned, fat, blood-soaked. We only ever used the term Frenchman or a Brit or Russ. It wasn't really bloody.
An angry, incensed people are the last thing the military and government of the empire wanted. Appeasement and conflict avoidance were the prevailing strategies.
Since the 19th century, there had been a kind of taboo against manipulating one's own population on the part of the executive branch. Governments were not allowed to do that. They got into tremendous trouble with their parliaments. And that still applied to the First World War. Propaganda was something you did to the outside world.
The situation was quite different for the Allies. Great Britain, and especially France, were not afraid to rouse their people. On the contrary, anger directed at the brutal enemy Germany spurred the population to persevere and the soldiers to fight.
They also had censorship, but there was the famous book Sous Verdun, which was a report about Verdun. It talked about how to sit there and possibly use dead comrades to repair a hole in the road because the bus had to move on. The book, with all the horrors in it, came out in 1916. The civilian government said we needed it to mobilize the population, to show them how terrible it is, how our soldiers were suffering on the ground.
In May 1915, the sinking of the American luxury liner Lusitania shocked the world. The ship was sunk by a German submarine. Almost 1,200 people were killed, including many Americans. The circumstances of the attack still gives rise to speculation to this day because of the rumor that the Lusitania might have had war material on board, contrary to international law. What is certain, however, was that the sinking became a propaganda defeat for the German Empire. For the first time, the U.S. was on the verge of entering the war. Only when German submarine attacks were suspended did the situation calm down, but the mistrust remained. 2 years later, the U.S. government was still advertising war bonds by using the memory of the Lusitania victims. The U.S. was no longer neutral. With the words, "Law is more precious than peace," U.S. President Wilson, after much hesitation, sent American troops to Europe in the spring of 1917. The turning point of the war had begun. As distanced as Wilson had been from the European war until 1917, he now resolutely provided psychological support for the troops. In order to inspire his people, who were actually war-weary, the president set up his own propaganda office based on the British model.
That was the birth of propaganda under Wilson. How do I get an American population that's not really ready for war to support the war quickly? It had to happen fast. The devices used were from the standard propaganda toolbox. The German was an inhuman Hun who kills children. The American population was naturally outraged by such monsters.
The new propaganda unit concentrated entirely on disseminating anti-German images as a way of protecting the American public against all hostile, evil Germans. It was headed by the journalist John Creel. Creel successfully relied on a hitherto unique propaganda medium, the 4-Minute Men.
These 4-Minute Men were, of course, men and women who tried, for example, to get the public in the mood during intermissions and movie showings with short, crisp messages. The messages were presented as slogans. They were also trained by university professors. How did a short speech like that work?
An army of volunteers was sent across the country, including numerous celebrities. Creel was even able to recruit the comedian Charlie Chaplin, who was already popular at the time, for appearances as a 4-minute man.
When speaking in public, and that was also part of these jobs, these 4-Minute Men had to always immediately gauge what the mood of the audience was like. We've always had this interaction between propagandist and audience. Propaganda is not a one-way street, but has to be linked to opinions, fears, and desires.
The Hun cliché had long since arrived in the U.S. The emperor was presented to Americans as a bloodthirsty monster who had unscrupulously made a deal with the devil.
Another important trick, Hollywood was fully involved at the time. That is, they produced the appropriate films. Who were actually the good guys? Who were the bad guys? That was still before propaganda was a science. They used the, at the time, normal tactics from the well-known propaganda toolbox. How do you create an enemy? You can do that relatively quickly.
The Feinbild production was a box office hit and ran a long time. Films with nasty Germans still sold well after the end of the war.
In the early 1920s, films were still being made in the US that drew heavily on this image of the barbaric Hun. They needed that. This was a first phase in which the wounds of war were still very strong, and there was actually a clear image of the enemy. The Germans, and much more than the Germans, the Austrians were the villains. They were to blame for everything.
Long lines in front of soup kitchens. In Germany, the gap between reality and the depiction of war was increasingly growing. The grueling trench warfare devoured all resources. The consequences were borne by the population at home. Skepticism about the official portrayals of everyday life was growing.
People believed they could control the images here just as they did that at the front line. But that was relatively difficult because the people knew how they lived, and they knew that there was no more bread to buy and that there were no more beets. To describe the daily life of a war in the hinterland as a paradise, that was not possible.
The soldiers at the front also learned of the precarious supply situation at home. They were asked not to have any more food sent from home, as it was urgently needed there. Hans Cordes worried about his parents.
In terms of food, we always get quite a lot delivered, at least always sausage and about 1 egg a week. You can always buy eggs for 30 pfennigs, so don't send me any more food. The Germans knew that they had to provide for their population, because if they didn't do that anymore, then they'd lost the war either way. Because first and foremost, they needed this population to get new soldiers for the front. Then they needed the manpower, and finally, they needed something like political social support. Unfortunately, I can't do anything for you. I hope you can still use the war kitchen. I still remember the soup very well. It really is a wonderful establishment. First, maximum prices were set, but the result was that farmers no longer sold goods where there were maximum prices set, but took detours and then put their products on the market in other areas. And so after that, you went to a distribution center with allocation with food ration cards. But then something like a black market developed, which increasingly deprived the regular distribution system of resources.
Lack of success, many casualties, catastrophic living conditions at home. The propaganda agencies of the empire had hardly any arguments left to stir up the fighting spirit of the soldiers and to maintain the support of the population.
It's relatively easy to visually exaggerate a distant theater of war, to depict it propagandistically, but it's more difficult in the hinterland. And that was also a very important reason why war propaganda was actually a failure when it came to convincing the home front. The big questions, the great distrust of the war, didn't come from the soldiers, but from those who stayed at home.
To compensate for the appalling losses at the fronts, the last reservists were also called up. Field Marshal Hindenburg tried to save the morale with an urgent appeal.
Wir haben dem übermächtigen Ansturm unserer Gegner mit Gottes Hilfe durch deutsche Kraft widerstanden, weil wir einig waren, weil jeder freudig alles gab. So muss es bleiben bis zum letzten. Nun danket alle Gott.
But unrest among the public was growing. Opponents of the war, such as Social Democrat Philipp Scheidmann, questioned in no uncertain terms the decisions made by the politicians and the military.
Für die Verteidigung unseres Landes, für die Verteidigung von Heim und Heer, wird und muss das Volk eintreten. Von der Führung des Krieges für irgendwelche Vergewaltigungsziele will unser Volk nichts wissen. Dem werden wir Sozialdemokraten, darüber täuschen Sie sich nicht, uns auf den entschiedenste widersetzen.
This conflict began in 1915-1916 because in Germany, as elsewhere, the population had been willing to go to war only because they thought they were defending themselves. It was increasingly difficult to sell this idea in Germany, in contrast to the other countries. Why? Germany was militarily very successful in 1914-1915, conquering territories, while the other countries were able to present their defensive role much better. And in Germany, too, the beginning and intensity of the argument about whether the war was still legitimate or not was particularly strong.
The slogans of perseverance of the military propaganda no longer had any effect. The soldiers had had enough of the pointless fight. Thousands of them voluntarily went into captivity. On the other hand, there was a revolutionary mood on the home front. The military leadership left the field to democratic forces.
Es lebe das Neue! Es lebe die Deutsche Republik!
The empire is history. An amateur filmed the monarch on his way into exile. Official images were not welcome.
Within a few weeks, this regime, which had waged an ironclad war for 4 years, was swept away. The emperor was gone. The republic had arrived, and a new era had begun. And this was something that no one could have imagined in 1917, that such upheavals were possible in Europe.
In Versailles, the Germans were blamed for the war. The former opponents demanded material reparations. The public should not expect any sympathy. The propaganda image of the bloodthirsty Hun had been deeply ingrained into the collective memory of those opposed to the war. What remained in Germany was a deeply divided society.
How do you make sense of it? Up until July, August 1918, propaganda claimed that they raced from victory to victory and that no one could stand up to the German soldier. And now we had the situation that the Germans were virtually slapped in the face with the message, "That's it now." And then not only is the war over, but you are all to be blamed for all the suffering in this world.
Dealing with memories of war is complicated. Poverty and hunger awaited the soldiers at home. Medals for the painful service at the front were frowned upon. Politically, the Republic was filled with unrest.
It was normal in Germany that in 1919 everyone said, we must commemorate the war and remember the heroes and the dead. And then there was a back and forth discussion in the local councils and administrations, and they couldn't agree on any plans. Then they didn't have the money, then it just withered away. And in 1928-29, when everyone started to remember the First World War again, there was another initiative. But it was completely from right wing.
The myth of the stab in the back was making the rounds. Undefeated in the field, betrayed by the army, images of war now became evidence of heroic commitment to the fatherland.
In the 1920s, the immediate history of the war became nationalistic. The war, which took place only a few years ago, was reduced to a few iconic scenes. For example, this heroic fight in the trenches. This is the war machine war. This is the air war, and so on.
War films were booming in the cinemas. The productions could hardly be distinguished from real footage, but the message was clear. The soldier is an admirable hero.
This wasn't backed up by facts, but as we know, images produce facts. Images that circulated in public constituted facts. And in the 1920s and 30s, the First World War, I would say, was actually reinvented. And it was invented in a way that we have in our heads today, but in a way that never happened.
A few years later, the National Socialists learned their lessons from the alleged propaganda defeat of the German Empire. The old enemy images survived the period between the wars. The renewed hatred fell on fertile ground.